US voters passed laws approving gay marriage and legalizing marijuana across several states. Is the United States becoming a more socially liberal nation? You're watching Inside Story, US 2012 from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihan Britansi. Some are presenting the US elections as a major victory for a progressive vision for America. President Barack Obama was re-elected despite attempts by Republicans to paint him as an angry, socialist, liberal African-American infringing on religious rights. For the first time in US history, gay marriage was legalized by popular vote in 3 states. And in another first for the country, 2 states legalized marijuana for recreational use. It was also a good day for the political representation of women in the US. 20, the largest ever number, were elected to the Senate. And candidates who had made glib comments on female reproductive health or rape were thrown out of office. In addition, in Florida, a law that may have restricted access to abortion was defeated. So, does the 2012 election signify a victory for progressives in what's been called the US culture war? To discuss this, we're joined from New York by Salon.com writer Irene Carmon. From Boston, we're joined by Frank Schaeffer. He's the author of Crazy for God, How I Grew Up as One of the Elect, Helped Found the Religious Right, and Lived to Take All of It Back. And here in the studio, we have Matt Lewis, senior contributor to the Daily Caller. Matt Lewis, I mean, some of the headlines in the progressive media must be terrifying, people at the Daily Caller. Welcome to liberal America was one headline. What do you think?
I'm hanging in there. I'm doing well. Look, I think it was serious. I mean, it was a serious election, and I think that Republicans and conservatives should take it seriously and do a little introspection. The thing we don't know is, well, we do know that America is getting browner and that America is getting more urban. The thing we don't know is if this turnout can be replicated when Barack Obama is not on the ballot. That's the big X factor. I think it's smart for conservatives and Republicans to assume that they have to fix their problems and get better at communicating. But we really don't know. Could Hillary Clinton or Joe Biden turn out young people, for example, or African Americans at the same rate as Barack Obama? I'm not sure we know.
Well, let's break down some of the developments in this election. Again, we are getting these sort of headlines, you know, that the culture wars are won, particularly actually that women are now finally ascendant in US society. So let's look at the steps taken as far as political representation is concerned. President Obama led Mitt Romney by 11 to 18 percentage points among women nationwide in the election. And a record number of women will be serving in Washington next year. The 113th Congress will include 20 female senators and 77 congresswomen, according to the Center for Women in Politics. The election also means that a record number of women of color will be serving in the House, 28. New Hampshire will have an all-female congressional delegation, in addition to a female governor. Hawaii, Massachusetts, North Dakota, and Wisconsin elected women to the Senate for the first time. And Arizona looks set to send a woman to Congress who is both openly atheist and openly bisexual. Irene Carmon, then, how should we view some of these strides for women's representation?
Well, the first thing is that, I mean, we are talking about 20 women in the Senate. We obviously make up more than 20% of the population. This is an amazing amount of progress, but it's very slow and incremental all the same. So we should celebrate, and we should also recognize that there's a long way left to go. But I think it's also really interesting to see how diverse the women in Congress are. It also includes the first 2 women in combat who have served in combat in the House, Tulsi Gabbard and Mazie Hirono. Also, I believe the first Hindu and the first Buddhist. This is really a reflection of the country, more people stepping up and participating. And I think in some ways it also feels very acute because women's issues became so in the forefront of the discussion this year. So there's a lot to celebrate, but there's certainly a lot more to go.
Yeah, I mean, does this mean, though, that the barriers to women entering Congress and political life have become lower then? I mean, what are we seeing here?
It's not so much that the barriers have become lower as much as there's more of a pipeline. I mean, it takes a long time to get to the point where you can run for Senate. For example, Tammy Baldwin, who is a very progressive congresswoman, was a very progressive congresswoman who is now the first openly gay senator. When she ran for Congress, that was a big deal. Wisconsin is a swing state. She is one of the most liberal members of Congress, but she has now been in Congress since 1998. She's well liked. She's got a record. In order for women to ascend these higher posts, they first have to, get into all the pipeline positions.
And very briefly, I mean, well, actually, not necessarily very briefly, but you mentioned that women's issues in inverted commas became key in this election. Was that then a vote of confidence in President Obama, or was it simply a reaction to a Republican Party whose perceived misogyny was deemed unacceptable?
I think it's both. I think President Obama broke from what has been a Democratic strategy for a long time. You certainly had Democrats, going back to Bill Clinton, with safe, legal, and rare, running from reproductive rights, running from abortion, out of the fear that it would alienate a seemingly conservative country. But President Obama decided that he was going to stand up against the Catholic Church, stand up against evangelicals with the Affordable Care Act and its coverage of contraception. Not only that, he was going to get Cecile Richards from Planned Parenthood. He was going to get Sandra Fluck, give them really prominent speaking at the Democratic National Convention. He was going to make speeches in which he sounded like a women's studies professor. So I think absolutely the Republican misogyny, a lot of comments that certain elected representatives made, that definitely helped drive women away in very conservative states, including Missouri and Indiana. But we also had a real affirmative argument to women, whether it was the Lilly Ledbetter Pay Act, the Violence Against Women Act,
right,
and absolutely Obamacare.
Well, we'll develop some of those thoughts later on in the program, I'm sure, about whether President Obama has been given a free pass. Let's bring in Frank Schaeffer, and actually, let's first then look at a wider demographic breakdown of the election, because we are now getting the figures. President Obama was less popular with male voters. Mitt Romney received 52% of their vote, but President Obama won 55% of the female vote. 60% of 18 to 29-year-olds voted for President Obama, as did 52% of 30 to 44-year-olds. Mitt Romney won a majority among voters older than 45. Romney carried 59% of the vote amongst whites. As far as the black vote was concerned, President Obama overwhelmingly won with 93%. Among Latinos, his share was 71%, and he gained 73% amongst Asian Americans. Frank Schaeffer, then, help us understand these figures. How did these demographic changes in figures and voting patterns factor into this debate?
Well, the demographics point out that the Republican Party has a real problem, and it's, to put it very bluntly, it's a problem of committing suicide by disrespecting women, minorities, African Americans, the gay community. There's only so many times you can tell a group of people to self-deport, or have people running for the Senate who make casual remarks about rape and these sorts of things which turn people off before the cup runs over and you are just dismissed as irrelevant to the modern concerns of most women, most Asians, most immigrants from Latin America, Latinos and others. That's what's happened. And I think to go back to an earlier point in your introduction, talking about the future the Republican Party would face and trying to make changes, you can't discuss this in an academic vacuum as if somehow they can just change their politics and beliefs overnight in order to win. Look, who is the base of the Republican Party? They're the folks that I write about in my books like Crazy for God. They are the evangelical Christians and the conservative Roman Catholic base. These guys do not change their views on things like abortion, on contraceptives, on marriage, and all the rest of this. And so the Republicans have a really tough road ahead of them, because while they can be more friendly, for instance, to Hispanics and try to curry favor with them by stopping talking about all their nonsense about self-deportation, while they can trim their sails and change the direction a little bit on racial issues, when it comes to some of the core value issues that they loosely call family values, they will lose their base. And so what you saw Romney face in having to be one candidate for the primaries and then having to lie barefaced into the camera, literally lie, and say, no, no, I never held those views, now I'm somebody else. That in a microcosm is the future the Republican Party faces. They've got to say one thing to the general electorate, but to keep their base on board, say a different thing. So until the evangelical right-wing fanatics, conservative Roman Catholics, and others who have these sorts of medieval views are no longer the base of the Republican Party, until that happens, till they can find themselves a new base of thinking people, science-based, information-based, fact-based, non-Fox News watchers, for instance, who maybe read a newspaper once in a while or hear a different point of view, they're stuck because they're always going to be pandering to a base to try to keep them energized, and at the same time, that base precludes them from having a general appeal to the public. And so that's the rock and the hard place that the Democrats don't face, because the Democrats are all over the map on a lot of issues, but they tend to have a more pragmatic base, people open to information and facts, science-based. They're not afraid of information. They're not religiously based primarily in terms of a kind of a fanaticism, although you have a lot of religious people like me who vote Democratic, but not from that right-wing point of view. So they're freer to make adjustments to face a future which, for instance, includes gay marriage. They're freer to face a future that includes stem cell research. Their future can include science-based curriculum in schools that isn't afraid to discuss evolution, for instance. So I just think the Republicans are really stuck. They're stuck because of who their base is, and that's, I think, the bottom line to almost everything we're discussing today.
Matt Lewis, I mean, how...
Shihab, if I could...
Sure.
Sorry, I just wanted to add something to what Frank said. I totally agree, and I would just say that historically, this is not an accident that they ended up at this point.
Right.
I mean, you had Pat Buchanan advising Richard Nixon to say, let's run on abortion, for example. Before basically the late 1970s, the Republican Party was not the quote-unquote pro-life party. You had the infamous Southern strategy to peel off racist Southern whites. Again, this is a coalition that they built intentionally. It's just that the clock has run out on it.
Well, actually, Frank,
Yes,
you mentioned strides that have been taken as far as gay equality are concerned. On Tuesday, there were several victories on gay rights. Tammy Baldwin from Wisconsin elected the first openly gay member of the Senate. Maine, Maryland, and Washington State have voted to approve gay marriage. And voters in Minnesota defeated an amendment that would have defined marriage as exclusively being between a man and a woman. Matt Lewis, I mean, of course, there's another way. I mean, they might not be able to use the Southern strategy, again, of trying to appeal to white Democrats who may have some misgivings about racial integration and so forth. They might not be able to do that anymore. But as we look at some of the new demographic forces in U.S. politics, like Latinos, for example, there are some conservative values there.
Absolutely.
I mean,
immigrating is the most entrepreneurial thing you can do.
But
if you decide to move your family to another country, you are the kind of person who's, I think, a risk taker and an entrepreneur. Those are conservative
but socially
values.
conservative. Might there not be a strategy in using some of the social prejudices of some of these communities, Latino and so forth, as we start seeing strides taken on gay marriage?
I think that there are plenty of...
So replace one fear for another fear, basically, amongst the electorate.
Well, I wouldn't talk about fear, but talk about optimism and shared values. And yeah, I mean, a lot of Hispanics, most Hispanics, immigrants, I think, are probably Catholics and probably share conservative values on life. But look, I think that a couple things. One, what I really believe we have to do, I mean, conservatives cannot simply write off urban people, young people, or college-educated people. It just can't happen. The world, voters, America is becoming more urban, more sophisticated. And what I think we have to have is more what I call cosmopolitan conservatives. People like Ronald Reagan, William F. Buckley, Jack Kemp, who were optimistic conservatives, who could talk to a farmer in Kansas, but talk to somebody up in the Upper East Side and be coherent and eloquent. And I think the Republican bench, I know my liberal friends are very happy today, and I'll let them enjoy it while it lasts, but the Republican bench is incredibly strong. Ted Cruz, elected in Texas, Marco Rubio, Susana Martinez, the governor of New Mexico, Nikki Haley, an Indian American governor of North Carolina, Bobby Jindal, an Indian American governor of Louisiana. These are young, conservative, and a diverse selection of
right.
up-and-coming rising star Republicans. So look, I think that the future is actually...
Are you not mentioning Chris Christie anymore?
I'm not going to mention Chris Christie now, but I think that the future is pretty bright.
But for them to gain ascendance and for a need for immigration reform and a more thoughtful approach towards the Latino community, doesn't the Republican Party basically have to split in half? There has to be civil war first, though, doesn't it? I mean, how ingrained is the racism is the question, I suppose. How ingrained is the sexism?
Very much
for that
split.
matter?
I don't think that the Republican Party or conservatism is racist. I mean, look, we just talked about all the great progressive women who got elected. If electing somebody is your definition of not being sexist or of diversity, again, the Republican Party just elected a Hispanic in Texas, a Hispanic leader, Ted Cruz, to the U.S. Senate. I mean, I don't know how many Hispanics that the Democrats have elected to the U.S. Senate lately, but Marco Rubio, Brian Sandoval, the governor of Nevada. If that's the definition of acceptance, then I think that conservatives are on the right track.
Is it simply then a matter of, okay, well, let's have some bipartisan consensus on immigration reform?
Right. Marco Rubio was pushing a DREAM Act.
Florida senator,
yes.
get him somewhere on the ticket, everything else, and then just basically continue as usual. Then
I think that just like electing female progressives is symbolic of openness and welcoming of a party. I think that there is something to be said for electing Hispanics, and Republicans ought to get a little credit for it. But no, I think that policies and substance have to match it too. Conservatives have to be opening. I think that there are a lot of good reasons, beside electoral reasons, a lot of good reasons why conservatives should be welcoming and encouraging more Hispanic immigration. Mm-hmm. In Israel, they have a cabinet position dedicated to recruiting and welcoming folks to Israel. And then they go through a 6-month immersion class where they receive a stipend. Why can't, I think Republicans should propose something like that.
Right, but Frank Schaeffer, we're about to lose you. I think very quickly, I mean, what role does the religious right have in the Republican Party right now? Can you see?
Well, it's interesting that Jack Kemp got mentioned, because Jack was a lifelong friend of mine and actually called me about 10 years before he died in reaction to some of the writing I was doing, like my book Crazy for God, where I talked about the rise of the religious right that my family was very instrumental in. And he said, you're quite right to turn against the religious right in the Republican Party. They will destroy the Republican Party. Jack and Bill Buckley, who also was a family friend of ours, were people who would not ever be able to have any traction in today's Republican Party. Look, your other guest here is talking as if the Republican Party is the same party that Jack Kemp was part of. It's not. They would have primaried him and put a
disciple, and he was the vice president. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Listen, I knew. I knew. Wait, let me finish my point. I knew him when he was hanging around Jack's office when he was 19. Look, here's the deal. The Republican Party is no longer the same party. I just want to say something. The Tea Party has changed everything. The religious right was on the outside as agitators when I was in it in the 70s and 80s, and now they're the people who are the backbone of the Republican Party, who you have to move to the right to primary to win primary elections. And so the fact of the matter is the Republican Party of Jack Kemp and Bill Buckley no longer exists. Jack couldn't run as a Republican anymore. The same thing would happen to him that happened to many moderate Republicans. Jack was not at all like Ryan. Jack did not want to downsize the whole U.S. government. In fact, he wanted to, first of all, open our borders to immigration. Secondly, when he was Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, he was very pro-poor.
Frank Schaeffer, very quickly.
Ayn Rand. He liked Ayn Rand when he was young, and later said he had moved past that. Today's Republican Party is not the party of Jack Kemp. It's not the party of Ronald Reagan.
How pragmatic will that religious right be facing mainstream extinction as far as issues of immigration and Latinos and so forth be? I mean, are they willing to start thinking about these issues and then say, hang on, we do actually share some conservative values with Latinos. Maybe we can be a bit more enlightened about immigration in order to survive and be part of the mainstream still?
The difference between the right wing today and when Jack was running for Congress or as vice president or these other people is this. Today they can live in an information loop, a bubble. They get their news from Fox News and talk radio. In the old days, people all got the same newspaper. Then they disagreed what to do about policy, but they weren't living in their own information bubbles, as both the left and right do today. So both sides have become much more radicalized. Both sides are much more extreme. The right wing of the Fox News watcher is not the right wing of the old days that Ronald Reagan was appealing to. Those guys were reading regular newspapers, having discourse with people. They disagreed over policy, but they weren't living in an information bubble. Right. So I really wonder whether the Republican Party can heal itself today, because I think if a moderate comes forward, they're going to be primaried and tossed out. The evangelicals will not compromise on their social issues. and they will take the whole party down with them if that's the consequence, because they think they're appealing to higher principles, i.e. spiritual values that have nothing to do with politics. In a way, they are a party of theocracy, not democracy, and that's the Republican problem, because there are moderate, smart Republicans like the gentleman you have on here with you today. If he was the Republican Party, there'd be no problem, but he's not.
All right.
The Republican Party is a fanatical Calvinist homeschool mom somewhere in Texas who's protecting her children from studying evolution and science. That's the Republican Party today.
All right, Frank Schaeffer, we're going to stop there for the moment. But Frank, thank you so much for joining us. Irene and Matt, you're going to stay with us for the remainder of the discussion. We are going to pause here, though. It's interesting that Frank there was mentioning Fox News, and the reaction of Fox News to this election result has been particularly interesting and particularly insightful, I suppose, as we see how deep the changes might be as a result. Here's how Bill O'Reilly analysis was formed the other night during the election.
It's not a traditional America anymore. And there are 50% of the voting public who want stuff. They want things. And who is going to give them things?
Bill O'Reilly there. We're also joined now by Joshua Frank. He's managing editor of Counterpunch. And Irene and Matt remain with us here. Josh, I mean, we're talking about then the reaction to the Republican Party to a changing society, perhaps a more socially liberal society. But yet we hear that from Bill O'Reilly, where it's, well, look, these people just, these are takers, not makers. They want stuff. So perhaps we just have to, I don't know, throw some crumbs and hope for the best. What do you make of this reaction?
Well, I think that there have been some movement towards progressive social stances among the voting public, but out west in particular, you have to be very cautious of saying that these are victories for progressives. There's a definite libertarian streak among voters. In my home state of Montana, for example, 4 years ago, they passed medical marijuana, but they are a very socially conservative state. But there's a libertarian streak. There's an anti-government streak. And I think there's an anti-government streak in a lot of the voting public when it comes to some of what the progressives might deem as their social values. They're also very much shared with people on the right and left, and a lot of those people vote during presidential elections as well. So I think the movement isn't necessarily to the left, but it's to more just economic and social values among a wide array of voters.
Matt Lewis, I mean, that's why some are wondering whether this is, we're leading to the further splintering of the two-party system. I mean, frankly, if you take out the religious right from the Republican Party, given how far right economically and in foreign policy the Democrats have got, you don't really have much of a difference, frankly. So therefore, I mean, therefore maybe you get different coalitions being built, perhaps, on civil rights or on marijuana or on the role of government or on so forth. We don't really necessarily need the Republicans and Democrats that much once you start sort of splitting up these.
It is interesting because he's mentioned medical marijuana or legalizing marijuana. I mean, we talked earlier about William F. Buckley, the great conservative. I mean, he was for legalize or decriminalizing marijuana. So it's and then you talk about other issues. Let's talk about like gay marriage. I mean, there are a lot of conservatives who believe that that's a good thing because marriage is a conservative institution. If gays get married, then all of a sudden now they're invested in their communities. They'll become more conservative, homeowners or whatever. People like Jonah Goldberg, a conservative at National Review, has made that argument. So I think it's a very good point. We try to put these ideologies in little boxes and say, if you're for this, you're a Republican. If you're for that, you're a Democrat. But I think it's a little more complex than that.
Irene, I mean, do you see that this isn't really necessarily a fight between progressives and Republicans? It's more nuanced.
I mean, the phrase that I think is very operative here is asymmetric polarization. It's true that President Obama is probably a center-right president in comparison to the Republican Party that we used to have. But the Republican Party that we've had and that was running this year was so extreme that I think it didn't push people didn't suddenly become more progressive as much as there was a backlash to that extremism. I mean, it's not Bill O'Reilly's job to elect Republicans, but what he said is basically the mirror image of the 47% argument, which really hurt Mitt Romney and is not how Americans see social insurance. And so I think that we have a situation where, they tried to run out the clock, and when Republicans controlled legislatures, they've been redistricting, they have been changing voter laws because they see the writing on the wall. But when people saw, again, I would never say that there's been a huge sea change, for example, on abortion, but when Republicans started going after Planned Parenthood, when they started talking about rape, when they started talking about contraception, that was overreach. People don't want to go that far in this country. They don't want to ban abortion outright. They may be interested in certain restrictions, but what happened was that one party sort of took it and ran with it, and then Americans said, no way.
All right, talking about running out the clock, we have now run out of time for our broadcast edition of this show, but we might just record 5 or 10 minutes more for our internet version on aljazeera.com. So do log on to aljazeera.com for that. But that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. All right, so we will continue our discussion. We have Joshua Frank of Counterpunch, Matt Lewis of the Daily Caller, Irene Camon of Salon.com. Joshua Frank, without the culture wars, and given the homogeneity of many of the economic and foreign policies of the Democrats and the Republicans, I mean, what do we have? What is the Republican Party? What is the Democrat Party?
Well, I think that they're both pro-corporate, pro-military, and it's easy to talk about social issues and the differences between the two parties, but on the ground, for instance, a woman wanting to get an abortion in 90% of America can't access the health care to do so. So we can talk about these sort of lofty issues during the presidential election, but when push comes to shove and on the ground, the issues that people deal with in their daily lives aren't going to change really much regardless of who's in office. There's a lot of propositions at the state level, for instance, for education and other things that will impact it. But on the broader scale, whether we're talking about foreign policy, where we're talking about the Wall Street bailouts, there is not, there's a dime's worth of difference between the two candidates, and but unfortunately, those aren't the issues that are brought to the table during the presidential debates or really debated in the mainstream press.
I mean, that's the point. Again, Joshua, I mean, you just joined us, but when you hear these phrases like "Welcome to a liberal America," I mean, there's a sense of cognitive dissonance. On the one hand, then we're hearing this was a great victory, even as for progressive America, even as the economic polarization, intensifies. President Obama, doubles down on the war on drugs, for example, both here and encouraging Latin America to carry on with that. The prison industrial complex. I mean, we talk about the demographic changes. President Obama deports a record number of people and so forth. I mean, there's this kind of weird distance between what I'm being told about the triumph of liberal America as I see President Obama striding onto the podium in Chicago, and the reality.
All right. Well, and it's, I mean, what if you're a victim of one of Obama's drone strikes? Or what if you're a medical marijuana clinic getting shut down by the feds in California and elsewhere? I mean, a lot of these movements towards, marijuana legalization, for example, or perhaps even gay marriage, it'll be interesting to see what the feds decide to do with this. They could essentially come in and take away the state's right and enforce federal law. And we've seen that Obama backed off on his promises in California, for example, to stay away from medical marijuana. So on a number of issues, it's really going to be telling over the next 4 years of where the Democratic Party wants to go. Do they want to embrace the movements across the West in particular, when it comes to gay marriage or the drug war or legalization of marijuana? It'll be interesting. But with foreign policy and a lot of other issues that are very impactful around the world, we're not going to see a big shift regardless of who was
so
to win
Irene, come on.
Tuesday.
I mean, we talk about there being a war on women, and certainly for the moment this was a victory against the war on women, and yet President Obama, there's certainly an international war on Iranian women right now with crippling sanctions, and how he seems to be competing with the Republicans on that, let alone not being more aggressive on the social safety net. In fact, perhaps preparing a grand bargain with the Republicans to weaken the social safety net, which will, as we know, disproportionately affect women as he pivots toward deficit reduction. We do wonder then, as we see these headlines about a new progressive America, an America under President Obama that's more positive for women, whether then progressives tend to take their eye off the ball and sort of miss the point about the rest of society and don't see that actually that isn't really the case in real terms.
Well, I want to go back to something that Josh said. He sort of implied that not that much is going to change whether a Republican or a Democrat is in office. Those 87% of women that don't have abortion providers in their counties, I think that was the number you were referring to. If you are a woman seeking to get an abortion, you want to live in a state that's controlled by Democrats. This is, I know that in many ways the Democratic Party has moved to the right, including on issues of reproductive rights, but just for the record,
in a different state. If you're an unborn baby, though, you want to be in a totally different state to live. So, you know,
there's so many levels to that statement, Matt. I don't know.
Right.
I don't know whether we enter the personhood or
all
what
I'm
we're
saying is
talking
that
about there,
I wouldn't want to blur the I just don't want to blur the distinctions between Democrats and Republicans. I think that is extremely important. And also, if we're talking about the civil liberties and protections, in addition to the right to an abortion with the Supreme Court, there's a tremendous difference between the parties on that front. I think that there's a tendency to, frankly, just kind of tar them both at the same brush. There are some issues in which there are massive differences between Democrats and Republicans. But yes, I certainly think no one should take their eye off the ball. I think that progressives absolutely have an opportunity to say, hey, look, now we're going to hold you accountable on all these issues, whether it be enforcement of the war on drugs or drone strikes. No one should take their eye off the ball, including women's rights advocates. You know, women's health advocates are still really angry at President Obama for bowing to the right and not making Plan B, emergency contraception, over the counter. Well, that's what a second term is for. He's not running anymore. Everybody can call in their chits. And I certainly think nobody should be resting on their laurels.
That was an interesting example there. Again, and we have been trying to understand who President Obama is. But if you can remind us of that, Irene, I mean, it was basically his own Department of Health, perhaps, who recommended that the contraceptive pill be allowed to be sold over the counter, and he said no. Purely what, for electoral gain? Purely cynically?
Yes, I think he was worried because it involved women under the age of 16. So he worried about this sort of rhetoric, but he didn't back down when it came to contraceptive coverage and Obamacare. So some people thought that maybe he said no on Plan B and allowed them to overrule on Plan B in order to kind of build capital for the next round. Again, I think that there's a lawsuit that's winding its way through the courts. I think, again, this is an opportunity for people who care about these issues to push the Democratic Party and absolutely take nothing for granted.
So, Matt Lewis, this connection between the culture wars and actually these very kind of distinct issues within the culture wars and the liberalism or not of the United States, I suppose, is the question. I mean, is there, if there are victories in certain areas for those who are looking for a more progressive agenda, does that necessarily mean the U.S. as a whole is getting more liberal or progressive?
Well, I mean, a couple things. I'm confused about, talked a lot about today about this so-called war on women. And it's interesting, I've interviewed a couple of authors recently, Hannah Rosen at The Atlantic and Kay Heimowitz, who have written these books about how women are outperforming men. Men are staying at home playing video games, smoking pot.
Right.
In their parents'
the war on
basement.
women was a specific thing about
women are doing better. They're going to college and at higher rates. They're making more money.
Right.
They're bosses.
Well, the war on women, of course, originated from what appeared to be a concerted effort by the Republican Party to curtail reproductive health care and reproductive health rights across the United States, and it didn't seem entirely coincidental that it was happening all over the country. Earlier.
You're talking about like Sandra Fluke, that she wants other people to pay for her birth control. I'm all for birth control. I just think Sandra Fluke, who goes to Georgetown and makes a lot of money, or is going to make a lot of money when she graduates at the age of 40, I assume it might be when she graduates. I think she could pay for her own condoms.
Yeah, Matt Lewis, we were talking about how the Republicans are going to respond to the changes.
Sandra Fluke already graduated, and she wasn't talking about her own birth control.
But I mean,
she was advocating for people in her community. Let's just get the facts straight.
There's one thing I would like to add. I mean, we brought up civil liberties, for example, and we can talk about the war on women. I think both parties have a pretty good case that they've both been anti-women rights for decades, but. Civil liberties, for example, the Obama administration supports the Patriot Act. We have secret renditions. We have a number of issues that Obama carried over from the Bush era and even before that, the Clinton era. And he extended it, he's expanded it, and across the country we have not seen a dissent among progressive-minded folks, primarily because Obama's a Democrat. If McCain were carrying out those same policies, I think we'd see people in the streets. So we have to be very cautious to say that Obama is going to protect our civil liberties and has a different view than the Republicans, because when he really on policy issues he doesn't.
Right. So when we talk about, again, so when we have these headlines as a result of some of the results some of the local results in this election, and they say, "Welcome to a liberal America." As a result, Joshua, I'm taking it then that you'd hesitate over that headline.
I would hesitate over that, or else we'd have to redefine what liberal means.
All right, well, we'll leave it there. Joshua Frank, thank you very much. Irene, come on. Thank you. Matt Lewis, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that's
Thank you,
all from
Chad.
the team in Washington, D.C. for now.
Thank you.